I'm sure you've had that feeling when something doesn't feel quite right within your body, whether it's a headache that lasted a few days too many, a tightness in the chest, or a tingling sensation that won't subside. You won't know what it is, but you would like for a professional to put your mind at ease. So, naturally, you go see a doctor. But what happens when you don't get the information you need? Or your referral isn't made? Or when your symptoms aren't believed? Do you accept what the doctor says? Or do you push for more?
The language that began to be used was your perceived inability to walk, your perceived paralysis. This word perceived had suddenly come from nowhere. And there was this jump to, oh, now because we can't find a label for this, it must be in your head. It certainly wasn't a psychological problem.
I'm Stephanie van Bismarck, and this is How Do We Manage, your guide to navigating a rapidly changing world. Our guest today is Tilly Rose, and she's something of an expert patient. She spent much of her life in and out of hospitals and was deemed a medical mystery by confused doctors who couldn't get to the bottom of her symptoms. In Tilly's new book, Be Patient, she outlines what she witnessed during her 2-decade-long journey to get a diagnosis. Her story is an extraordinary account of what the issues are within health systems and how she fought through them. And we hope it will inspire you not to give up, no matter how small you consider the symptom. So, let's get into it. How do we manage advocating for our own health? Welcome to How Do We Manage, Tilly Rose. It's really a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you very much for having me and for helping me to raise awareness for the patient voice. That's great.
You're truly what I would call an expert patient. I think you call yourself that.
Sadly.
And it's your story is an extreme story, and I think it's important for our listeners to understand where you actually come from and how this started, because we're talking about advocating for your own health.
Yes.
So tell me a little bit about it. What is your story?
Well, yeah, as you say, I really have become the expert patient, which I often say is the expert that nobody wants to be in life.
Mm-hmm.
But sadly, that was the cards that were dealt to me. And my journey began when I was 10 years old. So I was a very happy, healthy child, and I became very seriously unwell for the first time, age 10. And over 20 years, I became what the medical community deemed a medical mystery. And as part of this, so many different areas of my body were affected. So it was a multi-system illness that was impacting every single part of my body. And I ended up seeing that our healthcare system is very much set up for looking at kind of the body in individual parts. So I say in my book, Be Patient, that I sometimes imagined that the doctors would cut up a photograph of my body, and the doctor who had the photograph of my head had no idea what my feet looked like. And it was so disparate that I became like this hot potato, passed from ologist to ologist, department to department. And it was through that journey that I really ended up becoming this expert patient, because I ended up seeing every corner of our healthcare system in my desperate bid to receive a diagnosis.
I think it's a little bit what they also criticize about the Western medicine system is that they look so singular. You come, I don't know, your shoulder is hurt, and they'll look at your shoulder, but no one looks at your muscles somewhere else that might be pulling on your shoulder, right? Which I think is a very different approach in the Eastern medicine, where they look far more holistically at the entire body.
Yeah, very true. The holistic approach just wasn't there. And I was, as I say, quite literally cut up into these pieces, and everybody was looking at their individual discipline and effectively then passing me on when they couldn't work out what it was. And yeah, I say that in that sense, if you didn't fit the textbook, you didn't really stand a chance. And I think that's a massive problem for patients who are suffering from rare or undiagnosed conditions, because there is then no pathway in place, even often to support you with the symptoms that you're suffering from, if you don't have a label. And my big problem over the years was not having that diagnostic label. But eventually, this reached a crescendo in 2022 where I ended up in a London hospital for almost 3 months.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was a long stint, and I was living on the open ward of AMU, which is effectively an extension of A&E. And normally, back to the idea of putting people into these boxes, they would identify what your problem was, and you would then be sent to the relevant ward in the hospital. So if you were suffering from a chest infection, you'd be sent to respiratory, or if you were having bowel problems, you'd be sent to gastroenterology. But once again, so many different parts of my body were being affected, they couldn't work out where to place me, and nobody would take ownership of me. So I ended up living in what I called my blue box on the hospital ward for almost 3 months. And
still no diagnosis.
Still no diagnosis. And at this point, I was having convulsion-like seizures every 2 hours that nobody could explain or stop. And so many, different parts of my body were being impacted. And just towards the end of that admission, I was told that I was going to be discharged on palliative care. Comfort care was the phrase they used.
Comfort care?
Comfort care.
That's brutal.
Yeah, which was terrifying.
Yeah.
And I still didn't have a label or a diagnosis to explain why I was so ill. And I was told I should already be dead. So it was very frightening. But my family, in particular my mum, who had been relentlessly researching my medical case for my whole life and desperately trying to find answers, couldn't get her head around the notion that you could be discharged on palliative care without a diagnosis. To us, that didn't make sense. And in sheer desperation, I ended up sharing my story on Instagram, and I put it out there, my medical history, the symptoms I was suffering from, and I asked if the world had any ideas. And the world answered, which was incredible. And we had patients, professors, doctors, nurses, PhD students, people from all over the world who got in touch with test suggestions, diagnosis ideas, treatment options. And we compiled all of these ideas into a master list. And I was then discharged from this hospital. When I had a follow-up appointment later, I had a consultant who I sat in front of, and we posed whether, there was other ideas or tests that could be pursued. And to put it in context, sort of how desperate it became, he sat in front of myself and my mum, and he said, "You need to give up searching," pointing at us over his desk, "and accept this as your life."
Wow.
And my mum said, "We're not accepting this as Tilly's life. Like, absolutely not. Like, he doesn't know us." But for somebody to be saying that to you, unless you have an advocate there kind of supporting you and fighting for you as a patient, that is such a vulnerable position to be in. So my mum continued to work her way through this list after that appointment. And there was one idea on the list that she kept returning to, and it didn't quite fit, but it fitted a lot of my symptoms. And to cut a long story short, I ended up in November 2023 boarding a plane to Germany, where I went for a very specialist scan, and I received my life-saving, life-changing diagnosis.
Which was?
They are called vascular compressions. So what had happened was a lot of the major blood vessels in my body had become squashed, and blood wasn't flowing to my vital organs. So some organs were receiving too much blood and some weren't receiving enough, and it was causing widespread problems. And it later turned out that these vascular compressions, this diagnosis and this label that I had at last, connected to all of the health problems I'd had in the previous 20 years. And it was sort of this domino effect that all of the conditions that I'd been diagnosed with, the symptoms that I was suffering from, ended up being culminating in this diagnosis that sort of explained this whole journey. And I ended up going on to have life-saving surgery, And well, I'm sitting in front of you here today.
Wow.
So yeah, and in that time, as you say, I became the expert patient because I saw our healthcare system from every side, and then I also witnessed another healthcare system. So
That's
yeah.
an interesting. Well, we're going to talk about that because obviously you have a little bit of a comparison, and I come from, I've lived in various countries, so I have a little bit of comparison too.
Yeah.
But I think, I mean, first of all, it's great to have you here
Oh, thank
because
you.
it's really special, and that you and your family really didn't give up fighting.
No, we never gave up. That was my mum's line. Her line was always, giving up is never an option. And that was drilled into me through the whole journey, which for me, yeah, I'm incredibly lucky to have somebody there fighting my corner.
Yeah, I mean, I know a little bit because my younger daughter has a chronic condition,
Yeah, you
and
said, yeah.
it started
It's
with 11.
a really
Not
similar
such
age
a,
then. Yeah.
thankfully, not such an extreme like 20 years is. God, it's really nearly hard to imagine your story, but it took quite a few years from being told to my child is just a sensitive child to my child is going to die more likely
Oh
soon.
my goodness. So you've
Uh,
actually felt that firsthand.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And I see when I look at you, you're young, you're beautiful and all of it. And if I look with my daughter, it's very much similar. And it's so often with chronic conditions and rare conditions, they don't, it's not that your hair falls out in chunks and you're having bruises sometimes where it's mostly invisible
Yeah.
for other people. And then they look at you and you think, God, whatever, yeah, right?
No, I completely agree with you. And I think what ends up happening with that is a lot of particularly young women who end up suffering from these chronic health conditions. I personally believe they don't get the acknowledgement for quite how horrific the situation that they're in is. And as you've obviously witnessed firsthand with your daughter, there's a difference between somebody who gets ill once, and that's obviously dreadful and it's shocking, and everyone sort of rallies around because there's this event maybe that's happened. But when something becomes chronic or undiagnosed, I think that you end up just having to adapt your life and trying to navigate some sort of life around that. But actually, what you're going through, nobody's really acknowledging, seeing. It's kind of happening behind closed doors. And as you say, often isn't visible from the outside. So you don't get that recognition.
I always thought to myself, is that very few doctors, anyway, that I've met in my life have this ability to acknowledge that they don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So them sitting in front of you, it's better and easier for them. And I've been in that position, and you have
Yeah.
plenty of times. I think in women, more than even in men, they're told often, and we're going to talk about that.
Yeah.
Well, you're probably it's all in your mind. It's all in your head. This is all you making up just because they don't come up with anything better.
And did you find that on your daughter's journey that at times doctors were saying things like that?
Exactly. So
Yeah.
either she was sensitive and she was
Yeah.
going through developmental stages,
Which is-
or the next thing, and I was interested to see your mother,
Yeah.
I was the
Yeah.
crazy mom.
Yeah. I wondered if you might say that. Yeah. Which is something that I actually think is an area that I've witnessed more and more with patients that I've met. This sort of mother-child relationship as well that actually really isn't talked about, but I keep hearing stories about. And I don't know whether you found this, but we found that along this whole journey, my mum, who was relentlessly researching, she only ever put forward ideas that she'd thoroughly, looked up, spent hours learning to make. She knew that those opportunities to ask the doctors those questions, they were that 5 minutes, on the morning ward round, and she had to use every opportunity that she had, not to be waffling but to really sort of pin them down. But we found that so often she was very patronizingly referred to as mum.
Yeah.
Okay, mum.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
mum.
like me too.
And I wonder if that happened to you as well. And I've heard from so many other sort of mother-child relationships that keeps happening. And actually, these mums are experts in their child's
Absolutely.
condition. They're living with them 24/7. The doctors are seeing them for that tiny window on the morning ward round.
Yes.
And actually, who better than the family to give an insight into, that this is what my daughter's normally like, and this is what's happened to her since this illness has started to affect her. You can make that comparison and that judgment. But it's something that really needs to change, because the language that's used and the attitudes towards, particularly as I've seen mums, is something that, the medical community, I feel, needs to start thinking about.
Absolutely. And I think to mothers out there, if you're sort of doubting or if you're uncertain, but you have that gut feeling that we so often talk about, and you know something is not right, you need to listen to that, because in the end, I guess that what drove your mother forward. It was
completely.
I knew it deep within me.
Yeah.
This is not it. There is something else happening.
Yeah, completely. And as you say, I think this concept that it's not that we ever expected the medics to have all the answers. When something's rare, when it's complicated, it's not that you're angry that they haven't solved it. I always said, I never blamed anyone for not having the answers, but I did blame them for the way that they treated us and the way that they spoke to us. Because if they'd have turned around and said, do you know what, this is so complicated and I'm really sorry that we haven't managed to solve it, but they treated us with kindness, that would have been a very different scenario. But like you, we found again and again that when they couldn't find the answer, rather than stopping and thinking, actually, isn't this situation worse? This girl is so seriously ill, and we're now having to tell her that we actually don't know why and we can't help her. Doesn't that evoke even more sympathy, you would have thought? But actually, it starts to become a feeling that you're in some way to blame for the fact that that answer hasn't been reached. And that trajectory that I've seen as a pattern again and again, it's quite unbelievable. And I'm very sad.
Yeah, I mean that these things have to change, and obviously that also has to do something with women's health in general.
Yeah,
I have a few sort of statistics that is, your case is an extreme case, and I really hope that no one ever has to experience that.
Yeah,
but it happens to a lot of people, and especially women. So for women, wait an average 2.5 years longer than men for the same diagnosis. I mean, that's already shocking in itself.
Really shocking.
And especially in autoimmune conditions, delay can be up to 4.5 years more for the same diagnosis. And pain, for example, women are twice as likely to get sedatives versus painkillers when they come and ask for help or management with pain. Do you think, in your comparison, probably also in research, we're going to talk about your book as well, that you found that difference also being a girl or a woman versus, men?
Yeah, definitely. And those statistics are shocking. But the stories that I've heard, the people that I've met through my Instagram community at that Tilly Rose, I have a large following of patients, and the amount of messages that I receive from women, the amount of patients that I've met who are female, who have experienced the very things that you're talking about, it is shocking, but it's happening. And I mean, for instance, when I was at the hospital in Germany, there were young women flying from all around the world to have this life-saving surgery. It was particularly, these compressions were something that particularly affected young women. And I ended up meeting so many young girls who had the most shocking stories. For instance, one of the girls was self-catheterizing up to 30 times a day because her bladder wasn't functioning. But she was told that she was refusing to wee. And to me, how can you stop yourself weeing? If you need to wee, you need to wee. And then there were girls who were being told that they had eating disorders and they were on feeding tubes and they couldn't physically eat because every time they ate, they were vomiting. And this was from a condition called MALS, which physically was stopping the food from transitioning through their duodenum down into their intestines and to be digested. So they couldn't physically eat. I saw these girls have their operation, and a few days later, they were tucking into a burger and chips. Like, these weren't girls with eating disorders. These were girls who had a physical problem that once it was fixed, could return to their more normal life. Every single woman that I met in the last few years who had flown for this life-saving surgery had at some point in their medical journey been told that it was all in their head. It's something that I've also experienced firsthand where, for instance, I ended up along this journey being diagnosed with a condition called Addison's disease.
Yeah.
And that is where your body, your adrenal glands, don't produce the stress hormone cortisol. And it's a very physical illness. It's a life-threatening illness. And in order to prevent yourself from going into an adrenal crisis, you have to inject yourself with an emergency injection, which effectively saves your life and stops you from going into a coma and dying. So this is something serious.
Wow.
When I was on the diagnosis journey and had these, once again, nondescript symptoms that couldn't be placed in a particular box during that journey, I was returning again and again to the GP, asking if they could do tests to work out why I was vomiting every morning, why I couldn't physically get out of bed. And to start with, I was being told, you need to motivate yourself, get out, walk around the block. Well, I've always tried to do everything I possibly can to help myself. And I would try and follow these instructions. I'd be there trying to walk around the block, really struggling to do so, coming back, being sick everywhere, thinking, this can't be right. Something's not right, physically not right here. And eventually, it was the same story, the same pattern. When they couldn't work out what it was, I was referred to a psychologist.
How did that make you feel?
Well, I think it makes you begin to question yourself. I remember my mum saying, this is not something mental, this is something physical. So having somebody that's telling you that, who really knows you, is so important. But not all patients have that.
No.
And I remember going to the appointment with the psychologist, and it got to the end of the appointment, something I share in Be Patient, and she said to me that she thought she'd cracked it. She thought she'd worked out what was going on. I thought, brilliant. Okay, we've been searching. I'm feeling so ill. This is fantastic. And she proceeded to tell me that I needed to adapt to life as a well person. Well, I couldn't get out of bed. I was being sick. I had all of these terrible symptoms. And there was no way I could adapt to life as a well person. I was physically unwell. 2 weeks later, I went into my first adrenal crisis, ending up in an ambulance, being raced to hospital to have life-saving steroid medication, diagnosed with an illness that I was told I'd have for the rest of my life, and required emergency interventions to save your life. It certainly wasn't a psychological problem, but
no,
yeah,
exactly.
It's a story I keep hearing.
I mean, that's such a remarkable story. And you even sort of taught yourself from in and out of hospital that you also made it into studying at Oxford.
I did, yes.
I mean, that is impressive, and it's a story of resilience. Where did you find that resilience within yourself to never give up?
I think when I first became unwell, when I was 10 years old, it was whilst I was recovering. My parents took me on a day out to Oxford, and we were just going for a wander around the city. I didn't know anything about the university, and neither did they. But we stumbled across a sign outside one of the University of Oxford colleges, Balliol, and you could pay your 50p or whatever it was to go and have a look inside. And I walked into the quad in Balliol College, and I turned around to my mum and dad and said, I'm going here. And it was like, one of those, everyone laughed. And but then the following year, I continued to be very seriously ill. And from that point onwards, I was in and out of hospital, missing massive chunks of school. I was told not to take my GCSEs. I was told not to bother applying to university. But I held on to this dream, and it became the one thing that I sort of had control over outside of this awful medical situation that was playing out. For me, it was the one thing I could do from the bed or the sofa. I could study. And that became my focus, my distraction. And it meant that I had something outside of patient life. And I'd say for any patient, whatever your thing is, if you can find that, there has to be something outside of the medical, because otherwise your whole life and your identity is taken over by this label as the patient. And I was so determined for that not to be the case that I studied from wards, waiting rooms, and incredibly was offered a place to read English, literature and language at Jesus College, which for me was an absolute dream come true. Whilst I was there, it was obviously challenging in that I was still navigating all of these health problems, missing big chunks of term in hospital. But with the support of sort of managing my degree around my health, I managed to graduate and get my degree. And I had something to show for those years when it would have been so easy to have given up.
You're really the living example for people to understand that they should never give up on themselves and their dreams.
Yeah, I think so. And it just showed me that the kind of focus and the distraction and the goal kept me going, definitely.
And then you even went further. You wrote the book, which is there to help others.
Yes. So as I touched on earlier, the London hospital admission, where I ended up sharing my story on Instagram, ended up leading to this large patient community that I developed online of now over 100,000 people. And I began sharing Instagram posts where in the captions, I would write chapters, as I called them, on patient life. But these were visceral, raw, real life chapters into the very human side of what it is to be a patient.
Yeah.
And even the visuals that I uploaded, it was kind of showing the horrors in a way, but also the interactions, the relationships with the staff, the relationships with my family. It was giving people a real insight into the reality of patient life. And the feedback that I began to receive was that it was validating other patients' daily reality that was something that wasn't really out there and wasn't really being acknowledged. So I was receiving more and more messages from patients. This community was growing. And as a result of that, I ended up, which was very exciting, getting the publishing deal for Be Patient.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea for it came about, one, because of this community, but I also had read, I don't know if it's a book that you're aware of, but Adam Kay's This Is Going to Hurt. He is he was a junior doctor in the UK, and he wrote a very candid account of what it is to be a doctor in our NHS. And I read this book and thought, there has to be a patient reply to this. He's talked about one side of the hospital curtain, but I've experienced every aspect of the other side of the hospital curtain. So that was where really this seed of an idea sparked from. And I ended up getting the publishing deal and writing Be Patient. And I was very excited because when it came out in hardback earlier this year, the Times referred to it as an antidote to Adam Kay's This Is Going to Hurt.
Okay.
Which for me was exactly what I was trying to achieve with this, to show that patient experience. There was nothing out there that I'd found giving an overview of the whole patient, the entire patient experience, and the human side of our healthcare system. So this really covers both the patient navigating it all, the families and the impact it has on the families, but also all of the different staff who work in the hospital setting, from receptionists to physios, chaplains, medics, nurses, really giving cleaners, giving an insight into everyone that makes up our system, and ultimately showing that it is the people that shape the patient experience.
Of course.
And I imagine with, say, you and your daughter, when you look back on those experiences, we always find that the things that we remember were those moments of humanity that were shown to us.
Yeah, exactly.
Not necessarily always the big medical breakthroughs or
no, the kindness.
Yeah, it was the kindness, and it was
the empathy.
Definitely. It was the cleaner, Mrs. Sharma, who made my mum a cup of tea every day when we were stuck in an isolation room. It was the maverick doctor, as I called him, who stayed late after work to try and research my case when everybody else was giving up. It was those little moments that you held on to and remembered that restored your faith in human beings. And I think those moments are sometimes underestimated when it comes to our health and our healthcare system, that how much they mean when you're in these really tough, challenging situations.
Yeah. And looking at the system, did you with all these extreme experiences, did you find, looking back now, what would you have done different, or could you have done different, or what could you advise someone else who's in a similar situation?
I think my way of coping with it and getting through, which I would say for any patient out there, was always having a plan.
Mm-hmm.
That was my coping mechanism. My mum and I would always say we wanted a short-term plan and a long-term plan. And I think the really hard thing about patient life is so much of it is taken outside of your control. You don't have control over it.
Yeah.
So for me, reclaiming a little bit of that control, when I say a short-term plan, I mean something as simple as saying that every day I was going to start juicing, or I was going to try a new supplement, or I was going to email that doctor that I'd been researching. Having, like, on a weekly basis, something that I was going to do to try and move this situation forward. It wasn't necessarily always about, just the end goal of getting the cure. It was just those moments that allowed me to reclaim that control. And then we'd have our bigger, longer term plan, maybe that we were going to book in an appointment with this consultant, or we were going to research this new diagnosis we'd heard about. And that definitely became a way of constantly moving forward and not feeling like the journey was ever over. I also think talking about it was integral, being able to say how I was feeling out loud. And I think for anybody supporting a patient, you can't necessarily always change the situation in front of you, but you can acknowledge what somebody's going through.
And be there.
And be there.
I think it's a massive, massive
Massively
impact.
so.
Yeah.
And sometimes just hearing those words, do you know what, Tilly? Like, it's awful. What you are going through is horrendous. I don't know how you're managing. I don't know how you're coping. Sometimes that's all that somebody can do. But the fact that they've acknowledged that is enough in that moment to allow you to feel validated for some of the horrors that you're experiencing.
So now you really benefited from taking it out to the broader audience, to the community, where really then somehow they help, you got new suggestions.
Yeah.
And now we read a lot about that people are constantly Googling their symptoms and asking ChatGPT. And there's a little bit of a danger to that too, right? So you can probably also go in the completely wrong direction. How do you see that with your own experience, with all these options we have now?
Personally, my own experience in that sense has only been a positive one of, using the internet, researching. Had we not done that, I wouldn't still be here.
Yeah.
So for us, learning about these different conditions, and of course that was the big thing actually that my mum was always very conscious of. She knew that if she was putting forward ideas that weren't relevant, that weren't correct, then she would instantly, as we touched on earlier, be dismissed by the medical community. So she would thoroughly research and say, use ChatGPT as an example, not just rely on something like that, but cross-reference, find lots of different reports to check that she could back up what she was saying with evidence. And evidence was key. Mm-hmm. She found that if she had that knowledge and that information, it was much harder for a doctor to dismiss her because she always had the next question ready, and it was a relevant question. So they couldn't, say, "Mum, be quiet, go away," because actually maybe there was something in it. And that allowed us to reclaim a little bit more power in those situations where you are extremely vulnerable. And on so many occasions, we could have just been sort of sent away. So researching thoroughly and having your evidence is key. We also found doing things like taking photographs, recording the things that were happening. For instance, when I was having these sort of convulsion-like seizures, as I said, the doctor might be there in the morning ward round, but if you're not having that in that moment, they miss it.
Yeah.
Your family, say, are seeing it all the time. So I think in another way, that's another form of evidence to be able to show somebody what is actually happening.
So you need to take charge. You need to advocate for your own. I sometimes joke when I said, because I've been there too, not only with my daughter, as like you basically have to find your own diagnosis and then you have to find someone who treats it.
Yeah, which is
a horrendous thing to say, by
the
way. But clearly, it's a message for anyone who's out there. And it's like, don't let the power be taken away from you.
Definitely. And your challenge there as a patient is if you've got somebody and a support network around you who can advocate and fight for you, then that is obviously a very fortunate position to be in. And I was very lucky to have that. What is really hard is when you're that ill, you're not always in a position to advocate for yourself. You're not always in a position to do that research. So one of the things I would suggest to patients is if there is somebody in your life, whoever that person may be, who cares, tell them what you need from them. So often I think that people in these situations, they want to help, but they don't know how.
Yeah.
And if your way of getting them to realize, how they can help is saying, do you know what would be so useful is looking into this condition or doing a bit of research for me, actually practical things that they can do to support you in that situation can be life-changing. And equally, if you don't have those people, then partly that's why I set up my platform. I've written this book because the book is full of what I write at the end of each chapter, patient survival tips, giving you ideas on how you can advocate for yourself, on the things you can do, as you say, to reclaim that control. Because you are in a hugely vulnerable position.
Yeah.
And the power balance between you, who's stuck in the bed, and the medics who you're so reliant on, who have so much power over your life, is one that can be really challenging to navigate.
Absolutely. Let's compare the healthcare systems. Why did you actually go to Germany? Why did that happen?
So after sadly being told palliative comfort care in the UK, I was told
I can't get over that.
Nobody else could. I was told there were no more tests that could be done. Nobody could help me, and I had to accept this as my life. And we weren't willing to accept that.
Yeah, good for you.
So the scan that I ended up going for in Germany was a very specialist scan. This was the only place that did this specific scan. And the hospital I ended up having my surgery at was a very specialist unit for the condition that I ended up being diagnosed with, vascular compressions. So that was the reason for going to Germany. And it did give me a different perspective on the healthcare system. I think probably one of the best ways to illustrate that was when I was in this London hospital, there was one doctor who in the book I mentioned earlier, I call Maverick, because he had all these ideas. He came along, I was living on AMU in what was the most horrific conditions. I was living in this blue box, as I called it. I had a window blind next to me that didn't open for months on end. I had a bed surrounded by bedpans that weren't cleaned. My bed wasn't cleaned for 30 days whilst in that hospital.
What?
Yeah.
Wow. A month?
Yeah. We had the next bed was so close to you that the back of the chair was touching your bed, and people were dying in the beds next to me, physically dying. People were climbing into my bed in the middle of the night. It was horror, trauma on repeat, day and night. It was absolutely horrific. And this one doctor arrived on a Monday whilst I was on this admission. And the awful thing about the AMU scenario was that each Monday, a new consultant took over the ward. So there was no continuity of care. So whereas if I'd have been placed under, say, the respiratory ward, you'd have had the same team coming to see you. I had a different person every week. And by the end of the admission, they were having to read 60 pages worth of case notes.
Which they don't have time.
They couldn't do of a Monday morning. So there was almost no hope. And then this doctor arrived on this Monday, and he was this breath of fresh air who could see the horrific, awful situation that I was not even living, surviving in. He could see how seriously ill I was. And he had an attitude that was, he wanted to try and solve this. He wanted to crack this case. And it was like this medical detective attitude. And that gave me hope at a time when it felt there was absolutely no hope at all. And it gave my family hope. But in that system, we saw how you could have this incredible doctor with this fantastic mindset, and yet the system was blocking him. So, for instance, he tried to get me moved to his ward, but because I didn't have what they deemed to be an infectious disease, and he was an infectious disease doctor, they wouldn't let me move to his ward, even though he could have then pursued the case and maybe got to the bottom of it. He had ideas for tests, but then the following Monday, when a new consultant arrived, all of his ideas were, as I say, swept into the no man's land of AMU, and they weren't carried out. So this doctor he got very close to what ended up being this final diagnosis. And I believe had he been in the right system, he could have cracked it. But the system stopped him. If we then fast forward to Germany, I ended up having these major surgeries, but then still presenting with symptoms that the doctors on one of the admissions couldn't explain. In particular, these convulsion attacks were still happening. And one of the junior doctors ended up overhearing me discussing my case with one of the more senior doctors. And he said to me, as I was leaving the appointment, could I do some research? I've got some ideas. Well, oh my goodness.
Sure.
I thought, like,
Go
I will
ahead.
grab your hand off. Please help me. Like, nobody ever offers that. This is amazing. And he went away and researched in his own time. And he ended up cracking the case, getting to the bottom of to why these attacks were happening, how they related to the vascular compressions. And it showed me that he was in a system that allowed him to pursue those answers. He was allowed to go off and think and discuss. And in Germany, what they would do in this hospital, they would sit around a table and they would discuss the patients, and you'd have different doctors from different backgrounds, different disciplines, discussing as a team.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just one brain, it was all of these brains coming together, as you said before, looking at the body much more holistically.
Yeah.
And I often say that in medicine, thinking and kindness is a winning combination.
Yeah, sure is.
But what this showed me was that thinking and kindness still don't flourish and work if the system itself is blocking you. And that was the comparison with Germany. 2 brilliant doctors, but one stopped by a system and one allowed to pursue answers.
So is that, if you could change the system here in the UK, would that be something you change, or what would you try and change to make it better?
Definitely, that would be one of the areas, 100%. I think communication and bringing together the different disciplines into a much more holistic approach rather than splitting the body up is essential. That was probably shown most viscerally in my London hospital admission, where in the bed next to me was a patient called Lena, who this story is shared in the book. And Lena had both kidney and liver cancer.
Mm-hmm.
So 2 very serious illnesses, 2 very serious cancers. But significantly, it was cancer. It wasn't like me, where they didn't know what was wrong with her. They did know what was wrong with her. And for weeks and weeks in AMU, she lay next to me for 6 weeks. And her family were repeatedly saying to the medical teams, why aren't you starting treatment? Why aren't you starting chemotherapy? And we heard this story play out beside us, where they couldn't decide which was the primary cancer and which was the secondary cancer. So which had come first. And because of that, neither team would take ownership of Lena and put her on their ward.
That was the argument?
That was the argument.
Oh
And this
my God.
went on and on. And as this went on, she was withering away. Treatment wasn't started. And eventually, which was unbelievably tragic and is a story that will stay with me forever, she passed away.
Oh.
Because treatment wasn't started in time. And that was back to, it was in many ways the same situation as me, where she didn't fit in the box. And it showed to me with our healthcare system, that didn't need to happen. So yeah, that's a huge one. And then, as we've discussed, this very significant problem that's happening for women of being told that when no physical diagnosis has been made, this jump to it's all in your head, which on that admission, I again saw firsthand, where day 1, I had doctors crying at my bedside as I was having these horrific attacks. And they were sympathetic, they were kind, they had all of these plans for all of these tests that they were going to do, which gave me hope in those moments. But then, as my admission continued and nobody could work out what was wrong with me, there was a shift in how I was treated and how I was spoken to. And I remember one of the days, a doctor arriving maybe 60 days or something into the admission, and the language that began to be used was your perceived inability to walk, your perceived paralysis. And this word perceived had suddenly come from nowhere. And there was this jump to, oh, now because we can't find a label for this, it must be in your head. And I remember my response was, how can this be perceived when it's so overtly visible? I'm saying that my tummy is agony and I look 9 months pregnant. I'm saying that my feet are burning and you can see they're covered in these horrendous rashes. Like, it was so visible and clear. How could it be perceived? But it was another example of this shift that I've seen, particularly for women, of jumping to the psychological, sending in psychiatry when the diagnosis hasn't been made. So that's another area. There's lots of areas.
There's lots of areas.
That's another area that I feel, really strongly about that needs to change.
I mean, I'm really grateful for the discussions we're having in the wide global public really now about women's health and all these shocking numbers, there was no research until 1993, as I said earlier. And it's like all these numbers, everyone, you can look it all up. For me, it's so mind-boggling how on earth a world existed with medical research and they just left out 50% of world's population. I cannot get my head around it. I'd love to understand how we can change a system that is definitely broken and so not set up for any kind of, especially not for the women, obviously.
Yeah. And I think one of the ways of doing that, and this is like what you're doing with your podcast, in the sense of these real life stories. I think stories have the power to create change. And we need to hear from more of these women. I'm getting these messages all the time on Instagram from women who have got the most shocking stories, and they need to be part of the medical education for the next generation of doctors and the current generation of doctors to open their eyes to what is happening in our hospitals, and also to seeing that this is very much a global problem. This isn't just something that's happening in our country.
No.
This is happening all over the world. I find that again and again, we're presented with all these statistics and numbers, but where's the patient in all of that?
Yeah, and how does it look in real life?
Exactly. And I think the patient voice, the patient often doesn't feature in the article. We hear a lot about the staff, which I acknowledge they are working in the most awful conditions. It's terrible.
Yeah.
But we have to stop to think about the fact that the patient in a hospital, at the end of the day, they can't leave and go home. They're stuck there.
Yeah.
So they're having to deal with these problems, these issues 24/7. So if the staff are saying we need better working conditions, which they do, and I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
For the patient who is stuck in the bed, can't escape, we need to start thinking about how does that feel to be that person? Absolutely.
How did you manage your own personal mental health, and how do you get over that?
I mean, it's been such a journey. It's been something that I think I have grown into over time. Day one compared to now, I've obviously developed coping mechanisms as it's gone along. But I often say what's very different about living with a chronic illness rather than something maybe that just happens as a one-off is you have to find a way to adapt, to navigate some sort of life whilst living with this chronic illness. And people talk about PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
I often say to my family that post-traumatic stress doesn't even come into it because you're constantly in it. It's happening again and again and again.
Mm-hmm.
So one traumatic experience has happened that would be enough to shake you and change your world, but there's no time to even process or reflect on that before the next one you're being faced with. So you end up being in this sort of survival mode constantly. I don't think I've even got to the stage of processing what's gone on for the last 20 years because I've just had to get through. So my ways of getting through have been my mum, who has been a massive source of support throughout this entire journey.
Massive shout out to your mom.
Yeah. I mean,
Really?
I wouldn't be here without her. She's saved my life on multiple occasions. Throughout this journey, she was effectively coaching me through it. So we constantly talked about it. She would constantly pose questions to me and allow me to get things off my chest. But as I said, we always had this forward thinking, looking ahead into the future, not dwelling on what had happened yesterday or the past, but constantly moving forward. And what that did mentally was it really opened my eyes to this quite significant difference between coaching and counselling. And often as a patient, the doctors turn around, and sadly you obviously experienced this with your daughter, and they say things like, "Oh, you're probably very stressed. It's probably stress. Stress is a classic when they don't know."
Especially in women, again.
When they don't know what's
one.
going on, it's stress. And I would always, I guess in a way, play devil's advocate and say, well, of course I'm stressed. Look at the life I'm living. Like, it's a stressful life. But there's a massive distinction between stress being the cause and you being stressed because you're so physically ill and the way it's impacting your life. But often in those scenarios, you're told as a patient, a way to improve this or deal with it is to go for counselling. And my response personally in my situation to that was, I did try it at times, but that wasn't the solution for me. That wasn't the problem that I had. But what I realized my mum was doing was she wasn't giving me therapy and counselling.
She was coaching
me. She was coaching me to keep moving forward. And it showed me that I believe that's an area that could be really revolutionary, particularly for chronic illness patients. And it actually led me to, I went and a few years ago decided to pursue that. And I did a qualification with the University of Cambridge to practice coaching. And I focused on patients. And that's something that I've been doing since and that I'm looking to now develop, because I believe that it was the coaching that was the goal-orientated, things like, as we touched on before, having the goal of Oxford. For me, that really did get me through. Having the goal to write this book, in one way you could say it was a pressure and a stress, but actually it was a focus outside of all of the horribleness that I couldn't control. Mm. But also, I think patients, if they don't have a figure like my mum in their life, or they're new to this, or you know, we've learned so much as we've gone along, and we still by no means know everything. But navigating patient life, there are so many tools and tips and tricks that we've learned along the way that have ended up being really valuable. But learning those as a patient can really change your experience. And I think that's what coaching can do that counselling, for me, didn't in the same way. And mentally, that has been the drive that, really got me through.
I think that's such an important thing to really repeat and say, because even if you think about it in a very sort of simple term about myself, if I'm sort of struggling with something, it's like, and my partner has this incredible ability to coach me. It's like a sports coach in a team to just and move and you'll do this. You'll get through this. This is gonna be great. And don't. Sometimes that's all you need. Sometimes it's this. It's forward. Let's not sit there. I had this conversation with someone I know the other day who's a severe burnout, and she's not getting proper help. And she also said where she has counseling, and she said, I can't sit there and dwell on what I don't know is happening, and I know I'm not well, but my life hasn't been so bad. It's what she needs, exactly what really, you explained, is you need that coach. You need that sometimes it's just forward thinking
to help
mindset.
You with that next step. What does that next step look like? And of course, there's a place for counselling, and for some people, and in certain situations, that's integral. But I think, as you say, it's very much down to the individual. And say in those situations that you've mentioned, that forward thinking, focusing on the next step, how to navigate that, could actually be much, much more helpful to somebody. If I had personally spent too long in any of those moments dwelling on the horrific experience that happened the day before, then I would never have been able to pick myself up to then deal with the next situation, which was coming along later that night. So I almost didn't have a choice in how to deal with it, in that if I was going to get through it, that ended up being the only way. But through doing that, I obviously developed tools that really helped, and that I adapted to. And that's the thing with patient life, it's unpredictable. You don't know what's around the corner. You can't, I talk about plans, but you also have to have that flexibility and learn how to throw that plan out the window if something changes later that day, because you can go into your appointment, say, with all of these, your lists and everything that you think is going to come from it. And then the doctor says something which you weren't prepared for, and that all goes out the window. And you have to be able to really learn to adapt, navigate. And those are skills that, I believe coaching can teach you.
Probably what everyone wants to ask, where are you now?
Where am I now? So I went over to Germany in November 2023 for...
It's really not long ago.
Yeah, not very long ago, for what I thought was going to be my one life-saving surgery.
Yeah.
We thought we might be in Germany for around 3-4 weeks, maybe. 18 months later, this summer, I just returned. So it was another journey that, had you told Tilly when she was heading out there that what was coming for her, I would never have believed
18 months you spent in Germany?
18 months in Germany, yeah.
Where in Germany?
In Düsseldorf. I ended up having 3 life-saving surgeries, and it was another case of the damage that living with this condition undiagnosed for so
such a long time.
It caused so many problems to so many different parts of my body that the treatment that was required, the medical detective work that was required, ended up being far greater than we ever envisaged. And I sometimes think it's better that we didn't know when we headed out there, because,
sometimes it's better
to not know.
No, yeah.
But ultimately, the amazing German medical team that I found, they got to know me as a person.
Mm-hmm.
They got to know Team Tilly as people, and we got to know them as people, the nurses, the doctors, the receptionists in this hospital. And it became a team effort. Collectively, they created a real life miracle, because for me to now be back in the UK, to be sitting here for a start in front of you, having this conversation, these are the moments that I manifested from that hospital bed. I would lie there having these horrendous seizure-like convulsions that were going on for hours on end in absolute agony. At points during the journey, I couldn't even move to go to the toilet. I had to be lifted off the bed. I couldn't walk. I was paralyzed on the bed. To go from that girl who lay there constantly trying to imagine that this awful experience was going to go into something positive, and that I was going to impact patient care. That's what I kept saying when I was lying in this bed. To be able to go from that scenario to now be sitting here discussing this topic that I'm so passionate about, and being able to do the things I'm now doing. Like, I've got the tube here today. Like, that's mad.
That's incredible.
Like, these ordinary moments. And I think that's something that so many patients feel. These ordinary moments become extraordinary. I've survived for such a long time. So now I am putting my efforts into changing patient care. I say be patient is part of my wider mission. I've started working with the NHS Confederation. Last month, I opened the Global Tuberculosis Summit in London. I'm working with medical organisations and charities and bringing the patient voice into these conversations. Because
Fantastic.
I feel that policymakers, medical communities, they're all talking about the patients, but the patients themselves aren't in those conversations. They need to be at the centre of those conversations. And as it stands, they're not. So my big move is to get the patient voice heard. And with my book, which the paperback is coming out on the 29th of January, we're hoping that that will lead to the patient voice being spread more to the masses. We want to get the voice out there, because ultimately, I say my story is extreme, but we are all patients at some point in our lives.
Absolutely. And we all know someone, at least, who is a patient at some point.
And whatever background we're from, I say however many exercise classes we take or juice cleanses we do, it's the one thing in life that none of us can escape. At some point in our life, we will have some interaction, whether it just be a GP appointment. And I find that when people do, everybody has a story to tell.
Yeah.
And as you say, whether we're invested in it for ourselves or for the people we love, it will have an impact on each and every one of us. So that is, my big direction moving forward. And with the book itself, I think that as we've discussed in lots of different ways today, medical education for the next generation of doctors is so key to changing this. We can have patients read the book and feel validated by it, but in order to create change, I want this book to be in front of the medical community and for them to see the human side of what goes on behind the hospital curtain. And from what I can see at the moment with medical education in the UK, there aren't the female patient perspectives on the reading lists. There's the scientific books that train them in the medical side of things. There are memoirs written by doctors, which is important to show them, how their role will be on the wards. But the patient perspective, which I think is integral to creating the wonderful combination of thinking and kindness that we're striving for, my next aim is to get Be Patient on the medical curriculum, because I think that could really be powerful in creating change in this sphere.
I mean, this is absolutely incredible. And I so hope and wish you the biggest success with all of those
Thank
plans.
you.
It's impressive. And then these moments is where I'm grateful to have this podcast, because it makes me, it made me meet people like you and share these kind of stories that are so important and potentially can help so many people out there.
Well, thank you for giving the patient voice a platform. I think patients, as you said at the beginning of this podcast, they are resilient. And
They are.
I've certainly learned to be resilient.
With the right mindset and the right coach.
Exactly. The winning combination.
Yes,
definitely.
Yes. Thank you so much for being here today. It was a wonderful conversation. I really learned a lot. Thank you. Wow, what an incredible, impressive conversation, and of course, person Tilly Rose is. I think I could take so many different things from talking to her. And one is how the systems in this particular case, probably also many others, are somehow broken and not reflecting what patients would really need. But of course, also learning from her personal story of never giving up, even though the world has given up on you, how important it is to have people around you, whoever it is, that are supporting you. So your support system is the most crucial thing, and to seek help and to take agency wherever you are in this kind of journey. Tilly's book, Be Patient, is available in paperback now. We have some amazing conversations coming up in the rest of the series and plenty already sitting in the archive, ready for you to listen to. Make sure to hit follow on whatever platform you're listening on to get new episodes delivered straight to your device every Tuesday.